Want to know why? Ask how. Howard, the who among us. The problem, the Ukraine. The real problem, the potential of a world war, like World War I, happening from a domino effect, a domino collapse. Zbigniew Brzezinski, 2 days ago, went on television and he explained that if a NATO country were attacked, all of NATO would fall into line and attack back. That's how domino effects happen. And because we are on the brink of a potential war, you and I need to understand more than I've given you so far on these videos of the thinking process of Vladimir Putin. And to understand that thinking process, you have to understand an old Russian concept. It's called the Third Rome. And here's how it works. Vladimir Putin sees a world of pure values facing off against a Western world of decadent values. Look, the Western human rights worshippers are even trying to shove homosexuality down the throat of the pure folks of Russia. Russia has an obligation. Russia has an obligation given to it by its history. And what is that obligation? Well, here's how the history goes. Once upon a time, in 322 AD, the Roman emperor, one in a long series of Roman emperors, who had been suppressing Christians, who had been going along with one of their primary publicity tools. The primary publicity tool of the Christians was martyrdom. Martyrdom is a bonding factor. It binds people together. It gives them solidarity. And Christians literally went begging to the Roman rulers of their local districts, begging to be put into the local Colosseum with lions and wild animals, begging to be torn apart. Because if they were torn apart limb from limb by animals in the center of an arena with a crowd of 30,000 or 18,000 watching, their soul would go not just directly to heaven, but would go directly into the presence of Jesus Christ himself. So there are diaries of Roman women who had had babies and were still suckling them, and yet begged and begged and begged over and over again. The Roman authorities said no, 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 and then finally caved in. And it was incredible publicity for Christianity. One Roman emperor in 322 AD finally put an end to all of this. He was in the middle of a battle. He saw a vision in the sun, a vision of a cross. He had his men paint their shields with crosses. And he had them re-enter the battle not just as normal Roman secular soldiers, but as Christian soldiers. And once he painted those crosses on those shields and won, Christianity had proven itself in battle. Very ironic, because Jesus Christ himself would have vomited at the very notion. Jesus Christ was the one who said, and look, let's cut the Jesus Christ thing. Christ is a Greek name. His name was Yehoshua. Jesus, Joshua. And Joshua of Nazareth said, when you are confronted by violence, turn the other cheek. He would have loathed what Constantine did. But Constantine turned Rome into a Christian city. So the first Rome to see the profound spiritual truth, the sun-giving power, the light-giving power. Remember, Constantine had seen that cross in the sun. The golden light-giving power of Christianity. The first empire to be totally dedicated to that Christianity. The first empire to spread that Christianity to every one of its citizens, to ban paganism, to banish it to the best of its ability. That first empire to see the one truth of God himself was Rome. Meanwhile, in 322, Constantine did something else. In addition to adopting Christianity, he took an existing city near the Black Sea, and he decided to consecrate it in his own name. He called it, it had been Byzantium. He called it Constantinople, naming it after himself. Why? To create a second Rome. And 170 years later, that second Rome came in extremely handy. Why? Because the first Rome was invaded by barbarians, and the land of Italy in which it existed was no longer its own exclusive empire. It was overrun by barbarians. The first Rome had fallen. And Constantine had deliberately turned the city of Byzantium into the second Rome, into a city that could rule the Roman Empire the way the original Rome had ruled the empire, but could rule over a far empire because it had an even greater insight into the truth of Christianity. We call that insight today Greek Orthodoxy. So the first Rome to bring the light of Christianity to the earth was Rome. The second Rome to bring the light of Christianity to the earth was Byzantium, Constantinople, a city with two names. Rome was only able to rule as a Christian emperor capital for a mere 180 years. But if you read Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, you'll see that the book shocks you. Why? It's in 3 volumes. It's a very long book. And only the first volume concerns the city of Rome and Italy. The second 2 volumes are the history of the continuation of the Roman Empire ruled from the second Rome, Byzantium. And Byzantium ruled from roughly 500 until 1453, almost 1,000 years. Far longer than the original Rome. The original Rome lasted about 1,300 years, which is a long time, but it was only Christian for 180 before it fell. Byzantium was the center of the one true approach to God, Christianity, for nearly 1,000 years. And then, well, meanwhile, a funny thing happened. A funny thing happened on the way to immortality for Rome. It's a story that I told you if you got to watch the video from yesterday. It's the story of how a bunch of Vikings came down the river system of Europe, of Asia, and discovered that there were rich pickings of humans who could be, men could be murdered, women and children could be taken, fucked, raped, and turned into slaves. Slaves? They didn't need slaves. So why were they collecting slaves? Because Byzantium, the city who, according to legend, whose streets were paved with gold, a city of incredible richness, because it stood at the center of a trade system, a massive trade system between continents, in addition to being the capital of an empire, a vast empire. Constantinople had money to spare. And the Byzantines, the folks in Constantinople, loved having slaves, especially gorgeous, fuckable slaves. And they paid a lot of money to those who brought them. Gorgeous, fuckable slaves. And the Vikings specialized in that. And eventually the Vikings learned that instead of traveling all the way from Scandinavia and then rampaging through a bunch of Slavic villages and taking a bunch of captives and then hauling them down on the same river system all the way to Constantinople, they could save themselves time and energy if they actually built towns, trading towns, on the rivers, down where all the Slavs, the slaves, were to be found. And among other cities, they built Kiev. And Kiev became and they called themselves the Rus, and other people called them the Rus, allegedly because of their red heads, because they were blonde, their hair was blonde and reddish, and they were tall and incredible, and certainly good at killing. And the Prince of Kiev in 988 AD, a Viking prince. We talked yesterday about his Vikingness. Slavic rewriters of history want to claim that Vladimir the Great, one of the first rulers of the Rus, the Russians, was a Slav, because they want to claim that their people has a history that goes all the way back to this incredible person, Vladimir the Great, a conqueror or killer. And yet the fact is that when Vladimir the Great was not yet the king, was not yet the emperor, his brother began killing off all the brothers, and he knew that he was next on the list. How did he solve this problem? How did he get out of this? He went to Sweden. Why did he go to Sweden? Because the ruler of Sweden was one of his relatives, and he was able to get together a gang in Sweden to come back down and put down his brother and put him in power. Does that indicate that he was of Slavic origin? Or does that indicate that he was of Viking origin? The fact is that Vladimir the Great conquered a lot of other Viking cities, several other Viking cities, and pulled them together for a brief period of time, what was called the Kievan Empire, and that was the original Russia. It was in the Ukraine. Ukraine was the original Russia. And he sent his emissaries to go hunting for a religion. They didn't like Judaism because they didn't like the dietary restrictions. They didn't like Islam. They didn't like the dietary restrictions. They went to Rome to see the Pope of the Catholic world, and they were impressed. But what really impressed them was their trip to Constantinople, to Byzantium. Because in Byzantium, the emperors had mastered the kind of showmanship that groups like KISS use. So bear with me while I repeat to you, these emissaries walked into this 3 or 4 story high room whose walls were covered with gold. Remember, Byzantium had the reputation of being the city whose streets were paved with gold, which wasn't quite true, but there was an awful lot of gold around. And these 3-story or 4-story high golden walls had lions' heads and birds' heads emerging from them in gold. And when they walked into the room, all the lions opened their golden mouths and roared. All of the birds opened their golden beaks and twittered and tweetched. They'd never seen anything like it in their life. But it was a big empty room. Where the hell was the emperor they had come to see? In the West, the Pope was the head of the church. In the East, the ruler, the emperor, was the head of the church. The emperor of the new Rome, the real Roman emperor in the view of the folks in the Byzantine Empire. Where the hell was he? They'd come to see him. And suddenly they saw a movement in the ceiling down at the end of this golden room. And some golden object that they could not quite make out began to descend slowly from the ceiling as mechanically as the birds and the lions with their roaring and their opening of mouths and beaks. And slowly that golden object descended, and slowly it became obvious as to what it was. There was a throne, a golden throne, descending from the simulated heavens in the ceiling of the room, and on that throne was the Byzantine emperor. Well, as I said, it was like a KISS show. The emissaries had never seen anything like it in their lives. And awe and wonder are close to God. So they went back to Vladimir the Great, and they said, only one religion was really close to God, and it was the religion of the Byzantines. So Vladimir the Great had himself baptized in Crimea and promised to take all of his subjects and turn them into the kind of Christians that were allied with the head of the Eastern Church in the new Rome, Byzantium. Byzantium stood from 988 AD until 1453 against a truly violent, militarily extraordinarily successful foe, the Muslims. The Muslims were so successful that in the 150 years after Muhammad's death in 630 AD, they were able to conquer a territory 11 times the size of the conquests of Alexander the Great, 5 times the size of the Roman Empire. They had assembled an empire 5 times the size of the Roman Empire that from its Atlantic end to its Pacific end was 13,500 miles across, more than half the globe, in fact, all of the known globe, to Asians and Europeans of the time. And the Byzantines had to stand against this incredibly successful space and town and city gobbling empire. And they did. They did from roughly 650 AD, 640 AD. The first attack against them was organized by Muhammad himself. So that would have been about 620, 630 AD, 628 AD. They stood from 628 AD until 1457, 800 years roughly, against the Muslims. And then when the Muslims acquired a Chinese invention, the cannon, and learned to use it to pulverize the protective walls of cities, the massive walls of Byzantium, Constantinople began to crumble under the pounding of the Muslim cannons. And finally, those cannons opened breaches in the walls. And in 1453, Constantinople became Istanbul, an Islamic town, an Islamic capital, an Islamic center. And the biggest church ever built, Hagia Sophia, the biggest church, the biggest Christian church ever built, was stripped of all of its Christian things and turned into a Muslim mosque. And when that happened, all of a sudden, there was a third Rome. A third Rome? What do you mean? Well, remember, Christianity had gone from the first Rome in Italy to the second Rome near the Black Sea, Byzantium, Constantinople. Now that Constantinople had fallen, there was a third Rome. It was the land of the Rus. But it was 1453, and the center of the Russians, the center of the Rus, was Kiev, the capital city of the Ukraine. And Kiev became the third Rome. And then slowly over the course of the next 100 years, a minor Russian principality run by minor Russian princes, one that was despised, a city that was despised because it had cut a deal with the Muslims, and it collected the treasure from all of the areas around it and gave it to the Muslims. It managed to survive by becoming the collector of the stuff, the loot, the taxes that the Muslims insisted were their due. But the Islamic Empire began to weaken, at least in that part of it, and the Muscovites, because their Islamic masters were weakening,
were able to overturn the situation and become the masters in their own geographic area. And they glamorized this, they romanticized this, they turned this into the great story of the liberation of the Rus from the Muslims. The city that pulled this off, that managed to publicize itself as the liberator of the Russians, used that publicity to become the new capital of the Rus, and it was called Moscow. And in roughly 1550, guess what it became? It became the Third Rome. And what religion is the one true religion? The religion that Constantine took on in 322 AD in Rome, the religion that was transferred, given its new capital in Byzantium, and the religion that was then passed on to the Third Rome.
to the Russian princes, who were now heads of the only true Christian church on planet Earth. So Vladimir Putin has a tradition to live up to, bringing the one true set of valid values coming from God himself to the world, and doing it by reassembling the Russian Empire. Because the Russian Empire, Rome had a massive empire of conquered peoples who lived peacefully under the Roman dominion. Byzantium had a vast, massive empire in which conquered peoples lived in peace within its dominion. Both of them had the one true golden rule of justice, of purity on the planet. And now, in 1550, that privilege was transferred. All of that glory, all of that magnificence, all of that light unto humanity was
transferred to Moscow. And it is Vladimir Putin's job, as he sees it, to restore that purity, that glory, that light of the one true sun that shined upon Constantine, to restore it to, first of all, the peoples who have traditionally always been Russian, the people of the Ukraine, the first Russia, the people of Moldova, the people of Belarus. And then, in all probability, it's his job to bring the light and glory of living under the one true view of the nature of reality itself, the Eastern Orthodox view. It is probably Vladimir Putin's obligation to bring that to the Central Asian states that the Muslims, for their empire, also still want. Chechnya, Dagestan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. In Zbigniew Brzezinski's opinion, Vladimir Putin sees it as his obligation to history and to humanity and to truth to reassemble the Russian Empire. And Vladimir Putin's view of his own history and his own nation's destiny fits that description perfectly. Hitler had a catchphrase, a slogan. It was Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One folk whose history came from the very earth that they had lived on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and who had a unique kind of subconscious that Carl Jung had explained. Each people, each Volk, has that is unique to itself, a unique perception of the world, a unique contact with glory, purity, holiness, reality. Ein Volk, ein Reich, one state in which that Volk can live. Ein Führer, one leader who sums up the will of that people. Louis XIV in France had an expression, L'État c'est moi. The state is me. I am the state. Anything I do on behalf of my entire people and my entire state. And Vladimir Putin is the Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer man of our time, without the poisonous racism of Hitler. And he is L'État c'est moi. The state is me. So when Vladimir Putin is accused by Zbigniew Brzezinski of megalomania and of narcissism, because he is the state, because he is the Russian people incarnate, this is not narcissism. Anything we would regard as narcissistic is something he's doing on behalf of the Russian people, on behalf of the former glories of Russia, which must be restored, on behalf of the Russian peoples in places like the Crimea, the Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus, who are crying out to him to be relieved of the riot and violence and terrorism that Vladimir Putin is sure they are experiencing at the hands of others. His obligation is to bring them peace. And the only way to bring them peace is to bring them back into the Russian Empire.
Vladimir Putin is the carrier of a tradition. The tradition of the Third Rome. This is Howard the Humongous, speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make, especially in a time of crisis. Or, want to know why? Ask how. And now, for the infamous spot of my peculiar disabilities. Now to try to find the off button. I found it. Now how do I push it? I don't know.